Patrick Swayze's name lives forever in Dirty Dancing and Ghost, but his final movie wasn't what fans expected. Hidden in shadows, Powder Blue slipped past audiences, carrying a truth far more haunting than Hollywood's glitter. This wasn't just another role. It was his secret farewell, coded in fragility and silence. Final curtain. The last role. For most of the world, Patrick Swayze will always be remembered through the glow of his most iconic roles. Johnny Castle, lifting baby in Dirty Dancing Dancing, or Sam Wheat's hauntingly tender farewell in Ghost. These films cemented him as a symbol of charm, strength, and romance, which is why his final role came as such a surprise. In 2009, just months before his passing, Swayze made his last leading appearance in a small, haunting film titled Powder Blue. It was not the triumphant blockbuster finale fans expected. Instead, it was an ensemble drama, a raw, intimate story stitched together from lives of broken people, played out in dimly lit corners of Los Angeles. For a man whose career had once defined romance and uplift, this ending felt different. The film was given only a limited theatrical release, quickly pushed to DVD and cable. No big premieres, no studio blitz, no fanfare to celebrate what would become Swayze's last on-screen act. For many fans, it passed completely unnoticed. Some didn't discover it until years later, tucked away in streaming catalogs. It was as though Hollywood had allowed his curtain call to slip quietly into the shadows. But obscurity doesn't mean insignificance. Powder Blue is striking when you watch it with hindsight. Unlike his sweeping roles in Ghost or Point Break, here he did not rely on charisma or physical prowess. Instead, Swayze played a more subdued character woven into a tapestry of grief, isolation, and redemption. It was a film about endings, both literal and metaphorical. Looking back, it feels eerily prophetic. And that's what makes this role so haunting. It wasn't just another movie in his filmography, it became a farewell disguised as fiction. His slowed movements, his quiet presence on screen, his willingness to step back into the shadows of a supporting ensemble all mirrored what was happening off-screen as his health quietly deteriorated. Unlike the bright spotlight of his earlier films, this was an exit shrouded in darkness. Some call it an accident, a missed opportunity, but others see it differently, as a deliberate choice, a quiet, personal way of saying goodbye. The final curtain of Patrick Swayze's career wasn't the roar of applause at a Hollywood premiere. It was a whisper, carried through a little-known film that, in its obscurity, spoke volumes. And when we ask why, the answer leads us deeper, into the heart of Swayze's own philosophy about art, fame, and how he wanted to leave the stage. Choosing the shadow. Patrick Swayze never chased the easy road to stardom. Even at the height of his fame, he made choices that baffled studio executives. He refused to become a machine for Hollywood sequels, no matter how much money was offered. After Dirty Dancing broke records, he turned down multiple sequel deals that could have guaranteed him financial security for life. "I don't want to kill the heart of a film by repeating it," he famously said. That decision told the world exactly who he was, an artist who valued integrity over cash, substance over spectacle. That same philosophy carried into his final years. Even as he battled illness, even as his body weakened, Swayze resisted easy roles. He didn't want to be remembered as someone who clung to fame. He wanted his work to mean something. And so, when the script for Powder Blue came along, a bleak, low-budget film about fractured lives, it struck a chord. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. Choosing this role was Swayze's way of leaning into the shadows rather than the spotlight. He had spent decades dazzling the world with his energy, his dance, his smile. But here, he chose a project that stripped away glamour and confronted pain. In many ways, it was a mirror of his own reality. A man staring mortality in the face, yet refusing to sugarcoat it. It's tempting to see Powder Blue as a misstep, but Swayze himself would have disagreed. This was not an accident. It was intentional. By stepping into this film, he left behind a statement that cinema is not only about joy and beauty, but also about struggle and truth. "I'd rather do something that matters than something that sells," he once remarked. And that choice mattered more than fans realized. His last role wasn't about giving people the version of Patrick Swayze they had memorized in posters and VHS tapes. It was about showing them the man underneath, the artist who valued honesty over nostalgia. Powder Blue was not the glittering farewell many expected, but it was the farewell he chose. And in that choice, we glimpse the essence of Patrick Swayze, a performer unafraid to face the shadows, even as the light faded around him. This shift from blockbuster star to quiet storyteller set the stage for the film itself. A tale less told, but one that echoed eerily with his own life. A tale less told. Powder Blue was not a film designed for mass audiences. It wasn't about soaring romance, heroic victories, or larger-than-life spectacle. Instead, it was a bleak, intimate drama about people on society's margins, struggling priests, fallen actors, lonely souls looking for redemption. The film wove together multiple stories of despair and fragile hope, bound by the theme of unseen suffering. Patrick Swayze's presence in this movie was almost spectral. Unlike the commanding energy he brought to Point Break or Dirty Dancing, here his role was quieter, more subdued, as though he was intentionally fading into the background of a story about broken lives. His performance wasn't meant to dazzle, it was meant to haunt. One of the film's striking qualities was its tone, raw, gritty, underlit, and unpolished. Watching it feels like entering a forgotten corner of Los Angeles, where dreams go to die. For fans who discovered it after Swayze's passing, the film felt chilling in its timing. His slowing movements, the subtle fragility in his performance, seemed to mirror the toll of his own illness. It's as though art and life were colliding, blurring the line between character and actor. That's what makes Powder Blue a tale less told. Unlike his classic roles, this wasn't about physical charisma or romantic magnetism. It was about fragility, about acknowledging the quiet suffering people carry in silence. And in retrospect, it feels like Swayze was offering the world a reflection of his own reality. At the time of filming, he was already battling pancreatic cancer, though he kept it largely private. He knew his body was weakening. He knew time was running out. And yet, he chose to invest what energy he had left into a project that mirrored themes of mortality and endurance. This wasn't coincidence. It was intentional storytelling. There's an eerie poetry in this. His career had given us some of cinema's most uplifting moments. Johnny saying, "Nobody puts baby in a corner," or Sam's ghost whispering ditto to Demi Moore. But his last role whispered something different, that life is not always glamorous, that endings are sometimes messy, and that there is beauty even in darkness. Powder Blue is often dismissed as a minor film, overshadowed by its small budget and lack of studio push. But when viewed in context, it becomes a profound statement, the cinematic equivalent of a handwritten letter tucked away in a drawer, meant to be found long after. And so, While the world continued to celebrate Swayze's brighter roles, this final performance remained largely unseen, a secret message encoded in cinema, a quiet farewell that would only reveal its meaning in hindsight. But of course, the tragedy is that most people didn't see it at the time. And that leads to the next chapter in this story: how his last movie arrived in silence and how it slipped so quickly into the shadows. Silent release, sudden fade. When Powder Blue finally reached audiences in 2009, it did so not with the roar of a Hollywood premiere, but with a whisper. There were no grand red carpet events, no promotional blitzes, no magazine covers celebrating Swayze's return to the screen. Instead, it was quietly dropped into a limited theatrical run before vanishing almost immediately into DVD racks and late-night cable rotations. For a star of Patrick Swayze's magnitude, this was startling. He had once headlined global blockbusters that filled theaters for weeks. Yet his final film slipped into the world almost unnoticed. Some fans only discovered it years later on streaming platforms, stunned to realize they had never even heard of the movie that marked his farewell. Why did this happen? Timing was everything. The film's release collided with the most fragile period of Swayze's life. By then, news of his cancer diagnosis had begun to emerge, overshadowing everything else. Media coverage focused not on the movie, but on his health, his resilience, and his quiet courage in the face of pancreatic cancer. The film itself became an afterthought. And without marketing, without Swayze at the center of promotions, Powder Blue had little chance. Hollywood, ever hungry for spectacle, had no patience for a small, grim indie film. So it slipped into silence, dismissed before it had the chance to leave its mark. But here's where it becomes haunting. That silence mirrored the film's own themes: unseen suffering, hidden struggles, lives overlooked. Just as the characters in Powder Blue were trapped in obscurity, so too was the film itself. And just as Swayze kept much of his pain private, his final work went largely unseen, like a reflection of his personal journey. It's almost as though fate aligned the release of this film with the quiet fade of Swayze's own life. No triumphant farewell, no box office hit, just a sudden fade into the shadows, both for the actor and the role. For fans who later discovered the movie, this silence only made it more powerful. Watching it became an act of rediscovery, of piecing together a puzzle they never knew existed. And in that rediscovery, the film transformed. It was no longer just an overlooked indie drama. It became a symbol, the hidden chapter of a man who left Hollywood not with fireworks, but with a whisper. And that whisper leads us deeper still, because behind this quiet release, behind the movie's obscurity, was a man carrying the heaviest weight of all, the secret of his own mortality. The weight of secrecy. By the time Powder Blue was filmed and quietly released in 2009, Patrick Swayze was already carrying the heaviest burden of his life: a diagnosis of pancreatic cancer. It's one of the deadliest cancers, often discovered too late. And for Swayze, the news arrived like a storm he couldn't escape. But true to his nature, he carried it with silence and dignity. Publicly, he remained strong. He showed up at red carpets. He smiled in interviews. He spoke about treatment with optimism, often saying he was determined to outlive the odds. But privately, he was grappling with pain, fatigue, and the knowledge that time was running short. In the middle of this battle, he chose to keep working, not on a blockbuster, but on a film that mirrored his internal world. Powder Blue became more than a movie. It became his personal statement. In its raw, low-budget scenes of grief, broken dreams, and redemption, there was an echo of his own reality. His slowed pace, his quiet energy on screen, those weren't just acting choices. They reflected what his body was enduring. The performance wasn't flashy because Swayze himself no longer had the luxury of being larger than life. He was real, fragile, human. And this is where the weight of secrecy comes in. Just as the film was overshadowed by his illness, so too was his personal struggle overshadowed by the smiling, brave front he presented to the public. He didn't want pity. He didn't want his fans to see only sickness. So he hid the worst of it, keeping his suffering out of sight while giving the world the image of a fighter. That silence took strength, but it also carried a cost. Carrying pain alone can be isolating, and in many ways, the film's obscurity mirrored his own hidden journey. Fans didn't notice the movie, just as they didn't fully notice the quiet toll his illness was taking. The invisibility became its own metaphor, a star fading, yet refusing to collapse. When people watch Powder Blue today, knowing what he endured during its filming, every scene feels heavier. Every glance, every pause, every movement seems infused with unspoken truth. It is as if Swayze was using the movie not only to act, but to leave behind a coded farewell. His exit was not meant to be dramatic. It wasn't meant to draw attention. Instead, it was deeply meaningful in its quietness. By keeping his struggle private and his art raw, Patrick Swayze created a final chapter that spoke not to fame, but to authenticity. And that contrast between his beloved blockbusters and this overlooked last film is what redefines his entire story. Legacy versus final revelation. When people think of Patrick Swayze, they remember the joy. They remember him dancing across the floor with Jennifer Grey, or whispering eternal love in Ghost. His legacy, for decades, was built on light, romance, and the unshakable charisma that made him a household name. But his final role changed that image forever. Powder Blue was not joyful. It was somber, heavy, and forgotten by most audiences. In its shadows lay a story of endings, of pain, of hidden suffering. The contrast between his iconic films and this obscure farewell is stark, almost jarring. How could the man who gave us so much light choose to leave us with so much darkness? And yet, that contrast is what makes his legacy even more powerful. Because Swayze was not just a dancer, a lover, a Hollywood heartthrob, he was also a man who knew grief, who carried pain, who faced mortality with honesty. His final role revealed the side of him that fans never fully saw, the vulnerable human behind the legend. Many never even realized Powder Blue existed. They mourned him through clips of Dirty Dancing and Ghost, unaware that his last performance was quietly waiting, tucked into obscurity. But for those who found it later, the movie complicated everything. It was no longer possible to see Swayze as just the eternal optimist. He was something deeper. This is the final revelation. That legacy is not only the moments everyone remembers, but also the endings most people missed. His career was not defined solely by blockbusters, but also by his courage to take a role that reflected truth, rather than fantasy. He chose integrity over spectacle, even in his last days. And so, his legacy becomes twofold. On one side, the bright and unforgettable classics. On the other, the quiet and overlooked Powder Blue. Together, they create a fuller picture, a man of passion, discipline, vulnerability, and truth. Patrick Swayze's life and career remind us that legacy isn't always about the roles that made the most money or earned the loudest applause. Sometimes it's about the choices made in silence. Sometimes it's about the film barely anyone saw, but that told the most honest story of all. And from here, his story shifts to those who loved him most and how they worked to protect that final act from disappearing entirely. Which brings us to his wife, his greatest ally and the guardian of his memory. A Widow's Vision. When Patrick Swayze passed away in September 2009, the world mourned the loss of a star. But behind the spotlight, his wife of 34 years, Lisa Niemi, was left carrying not only her grief, but also his memory. She became the guardian of his legacy, the one person determined to make sure that his story, including his final film, would not fade into silence. Lisa had been by Swayze's side through every stage, from his meteoric rise in Dirty Dancing to his private fight with pancreatic cancer. She knew the choices he made were never random. And when people dismissed Powder Blue as a small, forgettable project, she understood it differently. For her, it was Patrick's final artistic statement, a role he deliberately chose, a mirror of the man he had become. In interviews and in her memoirs, Lisa described how much Swayze valued authenticity. He didn't want to be remembered just for the shine, she wrote. He wanted people to know he was real, that he lived truthfully until the very end. To her, Powder Blue was not a career misstep, but a personal reflection, a subtle, somber way of saying goodbye. Through Lisa's eyes, the film takes on new weight. It isn't just about its box office performance or its critical reception. It's about intention. Patrick knew his time was limited. He knew he couldn't take on big productions, but instead of retreating, he chose a story that spoke of brokenness, redemption, and survival. Stories that mirrored his own journey. After his death, Lisa became his voice. She shared their love story in books like Worth Fighting For, detailing not just his illness, but the strength of their bond. She described how he worked on set, even when physically drained, refusing to let cancer dictate his art. And she explained how his final choice of role revealed his courage, the courage to face the end honestly. Lisa's devotion kept Powder Blue from vanishing completely. Her reflections reframed it as a piece of his soul, not a footnote. Through her, fans began to understand that the film wasn't meant to dazzle the masses. It was meant to be personal, intimate, real. And that vision has changed how people remember it. No longer just an obscure indie drama, Powder Blue has become a kind of hidden memorial. For Lisa, for fans, and for scholars of cinema, it represents the truth of Swayze's final chapter. And in time, that truth would resurface, not just through Lisa's words, but through a new wave of viewers who stumbled across the film years later. Rediscovery in retrospect. For years, Powder Blue remained buried in obscurity. Few saw it, fewer remembered it. But over time, something changed. Streaming platforms quietly reintroduced Patrick Swayze's final performance, and suddenly, audiences revisited it with new eyes. What they found wasn't failure. It was fragility and authenticity. Instead of the vibrant, larger-than-life star from Dirty Dancing or Ghost, they discovered a man who looked vulnerable, weary, yet still fiercely committed to his craft. Every slowed movement, every quiet gesture, seemed infused with hidden meaning. Critics began calling it a cult relic, a forgotten treasure that revealed more of Swayze's humanity than his blockbusters ever could. The contrast was sharp but poetic. Once he embodied romance and vitality. Here he embodied fragility and mortality. His career had come full circle, from bright beginnings to a shadowed farewell. Fans who found the film years later admitted they never knew it existed, yet watching it brought a deeper connection. It felt like discovering the part of Swayze he had kept hidden, the part that was honest about suffering. Today, Powder Blue is no longer dismissed. It is remembered as a testament, a quiet, coded farewell from a man who chose truth over spectacle, leaving behind not glamour, but raw humanity. The dark truth unveiled and the shadowed goodbye. Many believe Patrick Swayze's legacy ended with the glow of Dirty Dancing and the romance of Ghost. But the dark truth is that his real farewell was far quieter, hidden in Powder Blue 2009. Far from a mistake, it was a deliberate goodbye. Battling pancreatic cancer, Swayze chose not spectacle, but honesty. "I want my work to mean something," he once said, and this final role proved it. The film's bleak tone mirrored his private journey: fragility, acceptance, and truth. Watching it today feels like reading a letter written in shadows. At the time, few noticed. Overshadowed by illness and Hollywood's hunger for blockbusters, the film slipped into obscurity. Yet that obscurity itself was symbolic. Swayze didn't want a loud exit. He wanted an authentic one. As his wife Lisa Niemi reflected, "Legacy is not what you take with you. It's what you leave behind." Patrick left behind more than films. He left courage, resilience, and sincerity. His final message wasn't a dance or a kiss. It was a shadowed goodbye, a reminder that true star power isn't just about shining, but about knowing when to dim the lights. That was his last gift. That is his eternal legacy. The shadowed goodbye. Patrick Swayze's final message was not a dance across a ballroom floor, not a passionate kiss beneath pottery clay. It was Powder Blue, a film quiet, somber, and often overlooked. To some, it may seem like a strange farewell, but to those who look closer, it was his most courageous act. This was not the grand finale of a star desperate to be remembered. It was the shadowed goodbye of a man who wanted to leave on his own terms. In obscurity, in honesty, in fragility. His choice to end not with spectacle, but with sincerity, reveals a truth about what makes someone truly timeless. It's not only their brightest moments, but the way they face their final chapter. "Legacy is not what you take with you," Lisa Niemi once said of her husband. "It's what you leave behind." Patrick left behind more than just films. He left behind a testament to resilience, to integrity, and to the courage of telling the truth when it would have been easier to keep pretending. His last film reminds us that star power isn't only about shining, it's about knowing when to dim the lights. That's what makes his farewell so moving. He didn't go out dancing in the spotlight. He went out quietly, authentically, leaving a story that fans could only piece together years later. And now, as audiences revisit Powder Blue, what once seemed like a footnote has become something sacred. It is not just a movie. It is a coded farewell, a final performance that says, "This is who I really was." Patrick Swayze's goodbye was shadowed, yes, but it was also fearless. And in that fearlessness, he gave us something far more enduring than one last blockbuster. He gave us the truth. That is his final gift. That is his eternal legacy. Powder Blue may have vanished quietly, but its meaning echoes louder with time. In choosing honesty over spectacle, Patrick Swayze revealed his truest self, not the eternal heartthrob, but a man facing mortality with courage. His last performance wasn't about fame. It was about truth. That is his enduring legacy.